All right. This session will be a discussion and training on Laserfiche workflow. We can get to workflow a couple different ways. It's in the Start menu, All Programs, Laserfiche under Workflow. End users who need to use the Workflow Designer might have it installed on their workstations as kind of like almost like the client. You install it and then can run it from your own workstation. It connects to the server, and you can manage workflows from this Workflow Designer application that's installed on the desktop, as opposed to, you could technically also do it from the server, but it's not necessary. The only thing the server has is the configuration manager. So why don't we just take a quick look at what the configuration manager does. It's usually set and forget. It's got the workflow server and the subscriber services, which are always running. You configure it to be connected to a particular one or two or more repositories. If email notifications are going to be sent out from the workflow system, you need to configure an email server. And if there are directories that include usernames with their email addresses and things like that, that would be in a trustee directory, which can be configured. And Laserfiche's workflow web services allows us to run a web-based workflow monitoring service. So that can be configured as well. So as we can see, they're all configured at this point. So they're all kind of, checked green. So that's good. And that's it, really. If this is all set, then usually you don't have to worry about things. Sometimes I'll come into a situation where the email server is not configured yet, but it's so easy. You just go ahead and add one, give it a name, tell it where the server address or IP address, whatever it is, and then you're done. So it's really pretty basic. So that's basic stuff. The most important day-to-day part of Laserfiche workflow is the workflow designer. That's where we look at existing workflows and build new ones. And whether you run it from your own workstation or from the server, it is run through the workflow designer application. So we're going to see that launch right here. And many times when you're building workflows, you are going to realize that your workflow maybe requires some metadata from a document. And if that document has a template and there's a field that doesn't necessarily exist yet, but you want to grab information from that field, you'll find that you're also going to be using the administration console at the same time. Usually that administration console is used to create new fields in the metadata management area. So you might create a new field, add it to a template, and then, because it now exists, you can go into your workflow and update some activities that will use workflow. But to start with the designer, let's go look at how you just kind of navigate within the designer. Initially, it may or may not exist. The rule manager and the search results tabs up here in the middle may not exist. You might open up the designer and get workflow 1, which is just kind of an empty workflow waiting to be built.
Okay.
And initially, the way you build a workflow is, first you need to define the workflow information, and almost every piece of workflow, whether it's the workflow itself or a activity that you put into the workflow, they all have properties. And the properties are on the far right side here in blue. And so if we look at the entire workflow, here's a workflow name. We usually want to rename it to something like, if it's in a department, usually it helps if we actually tell what department and then maybe the purpose of the
the process or what it is they're doing.
Right, exactly. So whatever that workflow process is. Description is not necessarily required, but can be very helpful with, either dates that it was first created, further information about what kind of processing it does, etc. But it's not absolutely required. However, below that is the connection profiles, and that is required. You do want to connect a workflow to a repository, and these connection profiles are configured on the workstation or the server to give you a default setting that connects you to the particular server and its repository with a login. Typically, here at Cities Digital, when we install workflow or any Avante system, we actually create an account called WF, and we have a special password for it. And that account is only used by workflow, not by end users. And it's not necessarily a full repository named user either. In fact, if we go look under our users list, there's our WF account. Look in WF, and you notice it's not a repository named user. It does have a password. It usually has full rights, both admin and feature rights. And it is then used by the workflow service to do its job whenever it's told to, do some kind of lookup or move or change or update within the system. It's got an account technically that can do all the things it needs to do. So once you've set that up with the connection profile, you're pretty much good to go.
Okay.
What we have over on the left-hand side is all the activities that you might want to use with workflow. So many of the things that you can do in Laserfiche's full client manually, you can also do automatically in workflow. You can tell it to look at a value in a field and then use it to update a field somewhere else, or change the templates from one template to another on documents. You can search the repository. Many times we build workflows that say, okay, search the entire repository for this kind of document, and when you find a particular value, use that to, I don't know, rename, move the entry, and then possibly even rename the entry. So in fact, what you get is a top-down flow of all activities in the workflow. They happen one after the other from top to bottom, as we can see here, with the green at the top as the start position. The first activity would be a search. We then would get some results back, and I kind of built this in correctly. What we really typically do on searches is run that against, let's scroll through my list of activities here, and do a for each entry, which is connected to that search, because we might get more than one, and then we might want to do 3 steps on each one of those. Find the value, move it, and rename it for each one of the found or retrieved entries. So that's kind of a quick example of a workflow. The search activity will typically be a search within the repository for documents per se, but it uses a syntax that is best found if you actually use the full client and use the advanced search syntax. So let's say we do a quick search for show me everything. Let's see, let's add the customize. We want to add search syntax, and maybe our search is to find everything eligible for cutoff, and that gives us one document. This syntax down here, if we copy it, whatever that syntax may be, this is just for record search, but whatever kind of search you're doing, you can simply come back here, paste it into the search query properties, and notice this exclamation in the red circle now disappears because you actually have put some value into this box.
Okay.
And in fact, you can even do a test, clicking this link for testing the series, and it says 0 entries. Well, and we actually did get 1 entry. So the question is, why did it not work in there? And if we look at the repository, we're in the wrong repository. So we logged into the training repository, and the workflow connection is actually, do we have it? Yeah, let's go ahead and add the training workflow connection. So that connects to the training repository. let's go in here and remove the test repository. And now if we actually run the search, it'll be targeting the correct repository. Should get a result of 1. There we go. And then for each, basically with that select, for each one of those entries, or at least this one case, we're going to retrieve the values from that entry. The question is what kind of values are on that entry, or what we might expect. Well, we sometimes have to go and look and say, oh, it's got this template, and maybe we want to pull back the date. So in that case, we say, okay, we're going to use the city clerk template, and I'm going to pull back the date field. So we can pull more than one field value, but this is one of those activities where it depends on what you're doing. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, though, is notice on the bottom here of the properties, we have a field value source. For a workflow to run, normally it's kind of kicked off by something happens in the workflow, right? Something happens in the repository. Somebody goes into Laserfiche, goes and updates a value in a field, which then triggers the workflow. So that document that was changed, or that entry that was changed, is the, quote, starting entry. So, and then workflow may run and take action on that document or do something else because that document triggered the workflow. But in other words, this document that was changed, that's the workflow's starting entry. But not in the case when you do a search. When you do a search, it's the searched or the retrieved entry. So in fact, we can't tell it to retrieve values from the starting entry because there really is no starting entry. We need to run it against the current entry from this for each entry activity. Mm-hmm. So that way you're saying, okay, for the first one, I'm going to retrieve the values from this first one. If there's a second one, the second one, etc. So it's kind of a logical thing. We're going to do the same thing on the entry to move. We'll do that current entry, and we're also going to change that on the, we're going to move the current entry as well. Or we could rename the moved entry. Really doesn't matter. They're both the same. But if you're being really specific, you could do that. And then for the move entry activity, you need to tell it where to go. Notice they always, if you've not configured any one of these activities, you get this little red circle that's warning you that you need to specify some setting. And in this case, for moving entries, this is one of the most common activities. The 3 that I've thrown up here: retrieve field, move entry, and rename. These are probably the most common entries because most people do this manually, and you know, why not do it automatically?
Yep.
And then in this case, we need to target where it should be going. Let's throw it into the test folder, and we'll rename it. And how are we going to rename it? Well, we'll use it from the date, and then I'll call it moved entry, something like that. Doesn't matter. And again, all these activities can be renamed. The activity names can be named to something more useful if you want, but you know, you can leave it the same. It just allows it to work. Doesn't matter what you name it, but it is probably helpful if you want to know what to do or what it's doing as you're building it, but not that you're going to ever do that. But this is kind of a very simple workflow, but this is the power of Laserfiche. I am going to call it onboarding space demo, something like that. And at this point, it's ready to be saved, and I'm going to publish it, in other words, because publishing is saving in workflow. So that would allow me to save it. And then if I wanted to start on a schedule or conditionally, you know, that'll be configured here. For some workflows like this search, if I want to run it manually, I actually don't need to set a starting rule. Okay. But searching, you know, this kind of workflow where there's a search is typically something that might run on a schedule. You have it run every day and at does the search and then fixes things. So this one we might put on a schedule. So if we do that, we get this wizard that says, how do you want to put it in? It's a schedule. We'll go through and say, well, we want it to run today, and 5 minutes from now, we'll let it run, and it'll run just once. So we could do that. And then if we needed to rerun every few minutes, we could do that. We could tell it to stop. There's some neat configurations, but basically workflow can be set to run on schedules or whenever it's triggered because some action occurred.
Okay.
At this point, we'll do that, but we don't have to wait. We can actually, in some cases, this one being one of them, run the workflow right here. It's got the play button or run current workflow, and that'll find the document, retrieve the values, move it, and rename it. One of the things I might want to do here is leave a shortcut in its original path because it's going to move out of where it is. I want to not just have it disappear, but I want it to leave a trace of itself once it was in there. And you can do things like use the move entry, but we can rename it and call it anything we want. I'll call it create shortcut. And I'm going to create a shortcut, and its destination path is going to be a token, and it's going to be the current entry path of that document. So let's see, let's do that. We'll put it in order so that its current path, which is wherever it is, puts a shortcut to the document, and then it moves the original. So that way we have that in place. So theoretically, let's go ahead and take a look. Where is it? Records Management, Finance, Payroll 2016. So Finance, Payroll 2016. There's the original document. And let's run workflow. We don't have to tell it anything except run. We get this little pop-up. There was some changes we just made, so yeah, I should save that. And it's running the workflow. And we can watch the progress. We can hit F5 to refresh, and look at it, it's all green. So that's good. It did a search, found the document, then did all of its steps. So theoretically, we should be able to go back to the client. We can see that there's a shortcut and that it got moved to the test folder and was renamed. So that's an example of a very simple, straightforward workflow. What we typically do will not only do that, where is that? There's our workflow. We can build them out, and as we build them out, there's all kinds of great things that we can do. Let's take a look at a few examples. I have built a few workflows in the past, one of them being, well, Steinhoffels is a furniture company out in the Wisconsin area, and they've asked us to do quite a bit of work. They're one of our best customers, I think, and they have always asked some of us to build workflows. I built a workflow that calculates the number of days in a month. And here's an example of a activity that can calculate dates.
Okay.
So pretty cool. It just takes today's date or whatever, and you can, if you look at it, run a date, which is today, and then modify that date by either subtracting or adding months, years, weeks, days, minutes, seconds to that particular value. So that's just an example of the date token calculator that was part of a workflow. We can close that workflow. And these folders here, I built these folders. Typically, you'll see just the ones at the top, right? All workflows down to business processes. Out of the box, those come with Laserfiche, and anytime you build a new workflow, it will be listed in the list of all workflows. So as you can see here, I've done some work over the time.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah, and I have some clients who actually have way more workflows than this, just for their own business. So it's pretty impressive what you can do. But they'll end up doing things like you'll look at them and just say, hey, I want to see all the workflows that have enabled rules, because some workflows might actually be within the workflow itself triggering another workflow that is not enabled. And the difference is, as we can see here with this checkbox, it might have some start conditions that tell it how the workflow will start. The workflow example I just did, it was a schedule. But most workflows are set to start based on something happens. It gets moved to a folder. It has particular information on it that has to be filled out. And if it's not filled out, the workflow won't start. So we can see here on this autofile workflow that it would need to be moved, right? So we have a starting event that would tell workflow to start only if the entry was moved and if all of these conditions were met. 1, it was a document. 2, it was moved to the 2.autofile folder. 3, it had the client files template. 4, it's in the training repository. 5, the client name is filled out, the date is filled out, and the document is filled out, and the user who's doing this is not the workflow account. Now, the reason why we put in the does not equal WF is we don't want workflow to trigger itself and get into a loop, which can cause real problems. So here's an example of that. Why don't we, it's enabled, and in fact, I can even demo that. So if we do an example, we'll take I don't know, let's take that document. Let's assign that client files template. We'll give it a client name, status, I don't know, doc type. It needs today's date, so let's throw that on there, or a date, etc. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and move it to the 2.autofile folder. Click yes, and theoretically, as we can see, it's gone. It already moved out. Yep. Well, it's now, is it in this folder? I don't see it here unless it's this one. Nope. So it theoretically ran the workflow, which probably would have put it in, if we look at the workflow itself, go in here and view the workflow, it was going to figure out if it was active, what kind of document it was, and where it went. Now, we could try and figure out where it went, or we could be smart and use our search and say, hey, I want to see recent activity within the last 15 minutes, which would show us, here's that document, and here's the instances of workflow that has run. And let's take a look. Let's double click on that instance, and it tells us, here's all the green things that went down. Oh, it went down the account app path, and it moved it to a particular path. And that was it. And that path would have been in the financial advisor folder with the active and then the client name. So theoretically, financial advisor, and then what was the folder in the workflow? Let's go look. It was client status path, client name, etc. And you know what? If we're really having trouble finding it, we can always click the Entries tab here. And we can see where it went. Training, financial advisor, client files, okay, and then client 2, and then the account app folder. So it was in the client files folder, client 2, it went into this folder, and there it is. So as you can see, there's an example of a workflow that's triggered by an event within the repository, as opposed to, yeah. So, and anything can trigger it, right? If it's in the repository and something happens and you've set the rule for workflow to be triggered by that particular event, like we saw there in the rule manager, then it's typically going to run the workflow and usually do its job. So that's, how we run workflow and build workflows. We could, step through let's add another starting rule here and step through the wizard when it comes to conditional starts. what basically we did was we looked at the rule wizard here, say that 5 times fast, and chose the entry type, the event type that was going to trigger this particular workflow. And you can use multiples. You have to do them one by one, but you have all these choices: created, deleted, moved, copied, changed, restored, or even the document signed. One of those can be the event type, and then you can add all your logical conditions. What's really neat about this is Laserfiche has provided a whole different range of ways to configure it, and these colors here indicate different items that can be changed. So you can use logic to say, if I put in a bunch of conditions, they can be one of 4 conditions. All of these can be true, have to be true. Any of these could be true.
Mm-hmm.
Any of these could be false, or all of these need to be false. So you can use various ways of triggering a workflow to get it to start. Once you've done that, then you start adding conditions. Right out of the box, it gives you a basic condition. Entry type equals document. Now, you could say entry type does not equal document, meaning anything but a document would trigger this workflow. And then you could say, this might not be a document. It might be a folder. It might be a record series is created, a shortcut is created for a folder, a document shortcut is created, or document or shortcut is created. So any one of these choices could be the trigger. And if you're really, interested, then you can say, well, the entry name could be such and such, or a entry field, whatever that field is, could be equal to whatever the value is, or notice when you change certain types of fields have different evaluations or operators. So in the case of code, it gives you all kinds of things like equals or does not equal to. If it happened to be a number, greater than or equal to, greater than, less than, whatever those might be useful in when the case is that those fields are dealing with numbers. You could say contains or does not contain. You can say starts with or ends with. You could use ranges, like between and not between, as well as is in and is not in. You could, the really obvious ones are empty or not empty. And we can even do regular expression matching, which you saw an example of regular expressions in our client training when we set a constraint, and maybe the pattern of that number is 3 digits hyphen 2 letters. Well, a regular expression could be set in here that would be, hey, it has to be 3 digits hyphen 2 letters. So if it matches that expression, or in other words, it matches that pattern, great. You know what? That'll do it. That'll be our at least one condition to start that workflow. Now, this could be enough, but sometimes we want to make sure that the workflow does not start inadvertently or by other means, and we always want to add the following condition: user does not equal the workflow account. This one will save anybody's bacon. It's the get out of jail free entry. It's, save your self from absolute destruction type entry. This is probably, if I can train any users on building workflow start conditions, and the only thing they remember is this, I'm happy. Because this will, because you log into Laserfiche usually as an end user, not with this WF account. However, workflow can do things like create entries. And we don't want the creation of an entry by workflow to trigger itself. If it happened to be creating, so if it happened to be creating a workflow, creating a folder or an entry in the same folder where this workflow might actually be watching, then we want to exclude that from being, triggered by the workflow itself. In other words, stopping the loop and preventing headaches.
Yep.
So there you go. That's an example of some. You can add additional criteria, whatever you need to make sure that it starts when it needs to. But if that's it, then you just hit publish and we're finished. So you can create, you can even copy multiple starting rules and then just change the conditions and change the name slightly. And you can have them all running so that several different conditions will trigger that one workflow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we see here. We see two conditions that would start them. Two are disabled, but if you enable them, you see I've even named them created and updated, so that if the document was updated or created, then the workflow would trigger. So we can have multiple rules that would trigger just one workflow. So that's the power of workflow. It's really the only things it cannot do is look outside of itself, right? It can't pay attention to things that are happening outside of the Laserfiche repository, nor can it, out of the box, put documents outside of Laserfiche. It usually can manipulate most anything within the repository or other repositories that it has access to, but it cannot, out of the box, put documents into a Windows folder somewhere. Now, we can do customizations that allow us to do that, to maybe copy a file out to a network share. We can do that, and we've done that many times in the past. But out of the box, the default functionality of Laserfiche workflow really has to do with everything within a repository or repositories.
Mm-hmm.
The neat thing is, workflow also can talk to, I should close some of these, we don't need to see these. Here's that instance that we ran. Let's close this one as well. We can talk to, at least with version 10, we can talk to Laserfiche forms. And forms can talk to workflow. You might have seen that in our forms training where we had a activity that actually triggered a Laserfiche workflow. Obviously, the workflow needs to exist first, but we can do things, if we look at our toolbox here, Laserfiche Workflow 10 has some neat things. We can actually tell it to talk to, as part of the workflow, the forms server, and we can say, you know what, we want to select a process. It's given, there we go. So within that form system, we did what? Expense reimbursement. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say, hey, I want to trigger the expense reimbursement from this workflow because I got some information from a document, and I want to basically start the workflow. And let's see, we want to do, maybe we had the date from that document. We want to fill in the date on that form. And that department, maybe we want to put that in there, and gosh, maybe the phone number. We can actually set the date with a value of the retrieved date from the system. So we can use the fill in the date field on the form with the date field that came from the document inside Laserfiche.
Okay, cool.
Which then, when it starts the form, if you're a forms user and it's supposed to go to, well, the variable would be, oh, I didn't grab it, but let's go do that. We do need to grab the name field because that's the user who should get the notification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and fill that in. We'll set the variable of the name to B, and we knew one of them was forms. We can do that here. And so at this point, this business process, if we set the description options to show it, it shows us what it's doing right here. And, oh gosh, maybe we can even do something like disable this and disable this. And all we're going to do is actually run that forms process. So let's go ahead and publish this workflow, even though it's really not. Oh, yeah, okay, we're fine with entries. And then we'll run it. Basically, it's going to start an expense reimbursement form for forms. And did we have, did it have required fields? I think it did. So this may not actually fully work. So let's watch what happens. Let's go ahead and run it. Okay, it'll show us what it did. Yeah, it had a warning. Let's look at the messages. And here's a great thing about the workflow. Anytime we look at, you know, the criteria, the workflow ran, but there were some messages. So let's go to open up the instance. We can see in the workflow that, oh, there was a problem because it has a warning. Let's look at the messages, and it says date was not found. Okay, so the document itself did not have a date, right? Well, that makes sense because we didn't do a search. So let's fix that a little bit. And there was no retrieved value. Let's just put a few days ago. So let's insert a date in there for us. The name is forms, etc. We'll go ahead and run the workflow, save the published, or publish the saved changes, or save the changes as we do it. Now we should see it ran. Look at that.
Yeah, cool.
So the really neat thing is, let's go ahead and look at the form and see what we get. Taking its time, of course, but we'll get there. And I'm logged in as forms. Let's see if I have any items. And I think this came in. Let's take a look at that form. Oh, it was, well, we're looking at it, but if we want to take a look at we can reassign it, which is always kind of fun. But it's in progress. We can open the task. So here it is. There we go. So the name was forms. Where was the, oh, come on. Redoing it. There's a date field. There's the date that we had filled in. Obviously, everything else was empty. But we had actually started this form from workflow. And in fact, the name of the starting person was workflow. So there you go. So cool. As you can see, you could, kind of by implication, you could see that one, forms can, if we looked at those processes, it can start a workflow from forms, which may then do some work and then kick something back and start another form in Laserfiche forms. So you can get this loop between the two products, which is
just automating everything. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is really powerful and something that out of the just an end user might not necessarily consider as being capable of the system, but it certainly is. So they try and train that at the Empower conference. They do have ways to enhance the use of forms and workflow. They've got a class specifically for this particular situation. So that's an example of workflow doing some invoking of business processes. You can do other things like, this is not an actual workflow, but we can do kind of token calculations. We can send emails. If we look at some of the workflows in here, let's see. That's the one I was just working on. Sorry about that. Let's go look at all workflows. Here's one that might be nice and deep. Okay, so here's a workflow where it looks up a user's name based on who started the workflow, looks it up, tries to find some initial information, sets field values on a document, sends an email from the system, and then waits for the document to be modified. Once it's modified, then we can see that it retrieves the new values, finds the approver user, and then has some decisions to make. It also retrieves the comments. But then down here, it branches out. So we can go down a approval branch, we can go down to an exception branch, or the submission is denied. So you can actually have all kinds of logic going on within the workflows as well, and each logic branch itself would have its own set of activities. So the sky's the limit. If you can think of it and maybe even draw it out, we can probably build it. We certainly can build it in workflow and get it to work.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm in the process of the Laserfiche CPP training, and the first one is workflows. So got to do the exam part first, but yeah, all looks pretty familiar to me.
Good, good, good. All right, so that is Laserfiche workflow. You know, as we saw, when workflows don't run, we can find out what's going on within the instance. If the workflow never started, there is another tool that is also installed no matter if you're on the desktop or on the server. There is the Workflow Administration Console. That gets installed with either the full server or just the Workflow Designer component, and it's available to the workflow admin person, if you want to call them that. And they can take a look at certain things. They can look at, within the console, they can look at workflows. They can look at some of the workflows that are in place and have been defined. They can look at some of the starting rules and all those conditions. So for the workflow, there's 3 on HR auto routing, as we can see here. Those 3, created, moved, and whatnot. They're currently disabled. You can sort by the column. Oh, there's just a couple that are enabled. So this one for client auto file, there's 2 of them enabled. And if you want to disable them, you can do that, etc. But the real power is you can look at some of the scheduled workflows. And finally, what I use quite often is, like the example I was just talking about, the workflow should have triggered, but something didn't work. It did not even start. So what one does is goes into the admin console, comes into the monitoring section, and goes into subscribers, and opens up the subscriber tracer. And remember that document we moved? Well, here's an example. Here's what happened. The entry was moved. In fact, it happened 3 times. The entry was changed. We didn't do that. That was when we were in the first folder. But then we moved it to the autofile folder. And if we take a look here, down at the bottom, we see that it evaluated to true because everything it was looking for all evaluated to true. If one of those was false, then the whole thing would be false, and it never would have actually triggered a workflow. And in fact, you can see that here. This one, it was changed, but none of those rules actually came into play because it didn't even match the correct folder path. This one, it was put in the correct folder, had all the right settings, and therefore triggered the workflow, so we know it worked. But then it was put into the folder, and that workflow, it didn't match the path. I mean, the path was false because the entry was moved or updated in that path because I think the rename occurred once it was moved. Well, that was a change, which triggered the workflow, right, based on the fact that it was a change, but the path was incorrect, so therefore it never started the workflow.
Got it.
So this allows us to troubleshoot further when we say, oh gosh, why did it fail? Oh, I see, it was in the wrong path. So now we know that maybe we have to change the starting rules or update something in the workflow itself. But that's how we end up troubleshooting workflows.
Okay.
We can also look at some error logs if there's any particular errors. They're in here. You can configure servers security. We can even do we can limit who can see what workflows. So that's something we can set up here under, I'm not sure if it's here, or permissions. There we go. Let's take a look at this account. So on here, individual permissions can be set to various users. And that way you can say, well, they can just look and search for workflows. Maybe they just need to create workflows, but they can't delete workflows or modify settings, things like that. So you can be a bit more restrictive on what any particular user does if they have the workflow designer. Maybe you want to limit that they can just do certain tasks even though they have the workflow designer. It's kind of like limiting the user administratively,
Mm-hmm.
but for workflows.
Yep.
All right, so that's the workflow administration console, which has quite a bit of different things. You can see workflows that have wait conditions. You can see if there's any particular sessions running. There's a few that actually are live, and so this is probably the Laserfiche workflow designer and the console. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
And the subscriber is always going to be running, so that's going to be fairly typical.
Okay.
So that's it for workflow. We've got the rule manager, search results. Sometimes, actually, I'm not done. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
The search results, if you come into the system and let's undo search results. That's not there. We'll close that. We'll close that. And you launch, let's do a discard on that. And you launch Laserfiche workflow, and all you get is workflow 1. That's fine. You can go up to the view and add your different items. Maybe you want to add the rule manager. Go ahead and do that. Now it's in here. You can move it around. If you need to see the search, that puts it down here along with common searches right along the middle left-hand side along with your toolbox. These don't normally come out of the box, but they are available to be added. You can do really neat things with the regular search. You can search by workflow name and by its particular version.
Okay.
So, every time let's say you had built the workflow, like the one we just built, and we then make a change. We delete that. That's a different version that we just saved.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that the HR demo, we can do all versions or a specific version, and we made 5 different revisions to that workflow.
Mm-hmm.
So every time we changed it, it has a version number, and there you go. How do you save a workflow? If you wanted to, before you made changes, you wanted to save the workflow somewhere where you could go back to a previous version. Well, you can do that. That is done by right-clicking on the, let's see, we can go to Workflow, and we can export the workflow.
Oh, okay.
And once you've got a workflow, we can even import them. So a lot of times, we at City Digital will build a workflow for a client, and then we'll export it, email it to them, and then they can put it into their system, do a bit of reconfiguration to match the correct repository, etc. And lo and behold, they've got a workflow that they really didn't spend too much time on themselves, but we could send it to them after we built it for them by doing a export and then an import.
Okay.
Exporting a workflow saves, you choose your workflow, and then when we do the export, it asks you where to save it, and it saves it as a WFI, workflow information file. And that's totally portable. It has pretty much everything you see in the workflow in there. It even has the connection profile in there, which is probably incorrect if you're sending it to some client, but it has all that information contained in it, all the steps, etc., how they were configured. Right. So pretty fun, pretty neat, and very flexible system. Let's see, we did troubleshooting, management, these tabs. We can do that if you want to. You can have them, automatically hide, so you get more screen space. They show up in a little tab over here on the left-hand side. It's kind of weird. I don't like it personally, but some of my clients do. Workflows. There are within workflow. You can do, some of the neat features are. You probably even see it. You can create a PDF, or you can import a PDF and retrieve the PDF content out of it. If it's a form, one of those fillable form PDFs, you could actually, you'd have to have the master form, but if you had the file, you can then say, oh, I'm going to grab that information from those 3 fields. And then maybe you could use that to create your own PDF that you want to generate.
Okay.
You can create web access and web link URLs from Workflow and then email them out. You can use Workflow to read XML files and JSON, which is similar to XML, and get data from data streams. You can do custom scripting. You can invoke other workflows. You can, as we saw, if you wanted a workflow that somebody could trigger from within the client,
Mm-hmm.
If you had a client and you wanted to add we don't have any in here. If you wanted let's say they had always went to a particular folder and they wanted to run a workflow on the document, but they wanted to run it ad hoc. They didn't have to, you didn't want them to actually change anything, but you wanted the workflow to run against that entry. You can build workflows, as they call them, business process workflows. Basically, down here on the properties of the workflow itself, you come over here and make it a business process, which means you can start the workflow on the highlighted entry.
Oh, okay.
Now, it also does another thing. You can track, for workflows, you can track the steps that a entry is going through with business process steps. So maybe we want to associate the entry, which is, I guess, the starting entry or whatever it may be, and then we can set it within it depends on where we go, and we can change the status of, once it's reached this point, we can say, hey, you know what, at this point it's now in progress. And with all this set, you end up with, on the document itself, when you open it up, you can get a business process tab over here that shows you all the steps it had previously gone through, its current status, and maybe even some instructions for you as the user on what to do with the document at this point.
Okay.
It's not necessarily visible. Where is that? There it is. We can add the business process pane. But there might, in this case, obviously there's nothing here. But you would see previous history possibly, as well as some instructions on what to do. But that's what business process means within the context of workflow. As we know, there's business process for forms, but that's the whole kit and caboodle. That's the whole thing. So different terms, kind of the same meaning, but a little bit different implementation as far as that goes. But there you go. So that's workflow. And you can talk to Exchange servers. You can create calendar items. You can do things like that. We have integration with SharePoint lists only. Integration with SharePoint really means, can you create or delete a list or maybe update a list item? That's it. Obviously, SharePoint contains more than just lists, but it's kind of useful in certain cases, but there you go. And obviously, we can interact with Laserfiche forms as well.
Okay, great.
All right, we're going to conclude our training on Laserfiche workflow at this point. If any questions are forthcoming, please let me know, and I will answer them whenever you have some needs.